Thank you, Ms. Sharma, for that very interesting presentation, and especially for the useful suggestions you proposed, and to prevent infection and obviously keep up immunity. After your talk, I really feel the limitation of a virtual conference, because I would have really liked to have met you and had a further chat with you. But I suppose maybe next time we will be able to meet in person, and our conference will not be virtual. But thank you so much. And due to time constraints, we'll take a minute of any questions or comments. Mashama, there is a question for you on the chat.
Okay. Can you read out, because I'm not able to see?
Do you have any idea about Sanjeevani plant mentioned in the Ramayana? Ravana's.
Okay. So there are several references for this plant, the plant the herb that we're having. But Sanjeevani is, as defined in the Ramayana, the whole procedure, I'm not aware of it because my background is not from the botany. People study Sanjeevani plant, but I don't think we don't have any references like it can cure all the illnesses. But yes, Tulsi, which I referred in this article, some of the people think that Tulsi has the ability to cure many of the illnesses. That's why people in India, they place the Tulsi plant at the entrance in the veranda that they have, and so that the air that comes inside the house is pure, that is free from any kind of bacteria and all. In every house you can see, the traditional houses that they have, they place Tulsi in the middle of the veranda that at their house.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sharma. I hope that answered the participant's question. There are some email addresses being given. We will forward that to you for you to obviously send your module to. And yes, we thank you again for your participation and really, really interesting presentation. Thank you so much. Colleagues, and as you know, we are having some time constraints, so I will move straight to our next speaker, Mr. Mukti Ray. Mr. Mukti Ray is a scientific officer and head at the hospital radio pharmacy section at the Bhabha Atomic Research Center. He is well published and the recipient of several awards in the field of radio pharmacy. Mr. Ray, a warm welcome to you, and you can proceed.
Greetings from the Nuclear Medicine Department of Bhabha Atomic Research Center. We are involved in the use of radioisotopes in medical diagnostics and therapy. The thrust today is in the area of theranostics, and I'll be presenting here a brief theranostic radionuclide in the last 1 decade from bench to bed. When I refer to bench, I mean laboratory bench, and when I'm referring to bed, it means the patient bed. Let us understand what are theranostic radionuclides. Can you see the second slide, please?
Yes, Mr. Ray, we can see your second slide.
Yeah. So let us understand what are theranostic radionuclides. A radionuclide that emits a gamma ray or an X-ray photon with the energy sufficient to be attenuated by a gamma camera while tracing the presence or absence of a particular pathology with least damage to the human subject qualifies to be called as a diagnostic radionuclide. On the other hand, a therapeutic radionuclide emits a particular radiation like the alpha or the beta particle that can cause lethal damage to cancer cells. When both qualities are present in a single radionuclide or a pair of radionuclide, they are designated as a theranostic pair. This radionuclide is sometimes tagged to a carrier molecule or a pharma molecule, forming a radiopharmaceutical, making it organ-specific or tumor-specific. Gallium-68 and lutetium-177 are considered a theranostic pair. Gallium-68, which decays to a stable isotope, zinc-68, it emits a positron. This is a potential positron emission tomography radionuclide. At RMC, we use an automated modular system to synthesize gallium-68 radiopharmaceuticals, and these radiopharmaceuticals are used in patients for imaging their body organs. While lutetium-177, which has a half-life of 6.17 days, is procured from BRC research reactor. It has a half-life of 6 days and has a beta energy of 498 keV and a photon energy of 208 keV. because of the high beta energy, this isotope is used for therapy. The 208 keV of gamma photon is an added advantage for lutetium in assisting in internal dosimetry once this isotope. At RMC, we use this lutetium-177 radioisotope to formulate various radiopharmaceuticals for radionuclide therapy. These radionuclide needs to be tagged to a bioactive principal molecule, which can be a peptide or an antibody or any other active molecule by a bidentate linker or a chelator. As you see over here, this is the radioisotope, this is the chelator, and this is a peptide. So once they are chemically tagged with each other, then because of the peptide, this peptide behaves like a carrier molecule. It will guide the radioisotope to the target cancerous cell. The cancerous cells, the peptide will bind to the cancerous cells, it will follow to be internalized, and the radioisotope, when it decays, it will cause its effective radiobiological effect. Since 2012, RMC has been using theranostic pairs of gallium-68 and lutetium-177 dotatate for neuroendocrine tumor treatment. Now, what are neuroendocrine tumors? Neuroendocrine tumors are neoplasms that arise from cells of the endocrine and nervous systems. They most commonly occur in the intestine, where they are often called carcinoid tumors, but they are also found in the pancreas, lung, and the rest of the body. They express somatostatin receptors. Now, what are somatostatin to do with this? Somatostatin chemically is a decapeptide. It is secreted by the D cells of the pancreatic islets and similar D cells in the gastrointestinal mucosa. It regulates both endocrine and exocrine secretion, inhibits the secretion of several hormones including GH, TSH, insulin, glucagon, and gastrin. It works as a neurotransmitter in the nervous system. And apart from that, there are many other functions. Now, this is the structure of somatostatin. And what we are using over here is an analog of somatostatin that is called as the dotatate. Okay. And here is the molecule where the DOTA part which is the suitable part where the radionuclide is going to bind. And this is the active peptide part. This is the active octopeptide part, which is the bioactive molecule. Now, if you look over in this second cartoon over here, now I can show you how the gallium radionuclide is bound to the dotatate, forming gallium-68 dotatate, and how lutetium is bound to this dotatate as a lutetium dotatate. Now, these two molecules are designated as the theranostic pairs. Now, this is again a cartoon which shows how theranostic pair has to be formulated. This indicates a radioisotope. This is a DOTA, which is the bridge between the peptide molecule and the radioisotope. And for neuroendocrine tumors, first the patients are imaged using positron emission tomography using gallium-68 dotatate. Imaging helps in localization of tumors and staging the disease. The patient is then given appropriate lutetium-177 dotatate. This is also called as personalized medicine. Depending upon the kind of tumors, accordingly the amount of the therapy, dose of therapy is chosen. After therapy, the patient is scanned for dosimetry and effectiveness of the therapy. At RMC, we have been using this theranostic pair since 2012 for the management of neuroendocrine tumor patients. This is a cartoon which shows how the analog behaves. This is the analog where the radioisotopes is tagged to that. This is a somatostatin, ASSA stands for somatostatin analog. It binds to somatostatin receptor, because of which this entire thing gets internalized into the cell. There the somatostatin analog will go its respective biochemical degradation as per its enzymatic pathway. It will leave the radionuclide alone, loitering inside the cell, and when the time comes for its decay, it will decay, and upon decay, depending upon the kind of radionuclide, the radiobiological effect will occur. Now, when I am saying radiobiological effect, I mean that in case of gallium, it will emit a photon for imaging. In case of lutetium, it will irradiate the cell and kill the cell. Now, this is a scan of a patient who had reported to RMC in 2014. If you look at, this is a gallium dotated scan. If you look at it, this is actually the image of the entire, of the patient. This is the liver and the kidneys, and this is, you can see the bladder over here. These dark spots, they are the lesions, the cancerous lesions. Okay, and this patient was given the first dose of lutetium dotated therapy. Now you can see, because of this is how this scan shows that lutetium dotated is accumulated in the patient body. When the patient reported back in 2017, when the gallium dotated scan was repeated, you can see the majority lesions have disappeared. This is another example of a patient who was very weak, and he was having symptoms of diarrhea and pain, abdominal pain. When a gallium dotated scan was done before the start of PRRT, PRRT stands for peptide receptor radionuclide therapy. So when this scan was done, you can see multiple foci of lesions spread throughout the body. And when the patient reported for the third PRRT, before the third therapy was done, if you look at the gallium scan, see how the lesions have come down, and after further 3 cycles of chemotherapy, the lesions have completely disappeared. The symptoms like abdominal pain and frequency of diarrhea also decreased, and the patient had a good general health condition. Now this is a cartoon which shows the amount of therapy that RMC has been giving since 2012. If you see, the popularity of this treatment has gained, and we had almost done 946 treatment in 2019. And 2020, because of pandemic, the patient load was very less. Then also there were 308 treatments, and in 2021 still now we have 131 treatment till March 2021. Similarly, we have another theranostic pair, that is a 68 gallium DOTA PSMA 11 and lutetium DOTA PSMA 617. These are the theranostic pair for treatment of prostate cancer. And PSMA 11 and PSMA 617, they metabolically target the prostate cancer cell, and they target the prostate specific membrane antigen. And in RMC, these theranostic pairs have been used since 2017 for the management of patients having prostate cancer. Again here, the 68 gallium dotatate is used for imaging the patient, to stage the disease and to know the spread of the disease, and lutetium dotatate is used for therapy. And this therapy we started since 2017. Until 2017, these are the number of patients we have treated so far. Now coming to the recent research we have been doing, we have been trying to do the development of yttrium-90 dotatate. Yttrium-90 is a pseudo-lanthanide, and it is a pure beta emitter, and it is generated from waste. So you may be aware that a lot of spent fuels which BRC has, they are from that spent fuel we have extracted this yttrium-90. And why yttrium-90? It is useful because it has a very high beta emission, around 2.27 MeV, and it is suitable for using for large tumor mass. And yttrium-90 and gallium-68 can be a matched pair in Thorano setting, and we have produced yttrium-90 acetate from high-level liquid waste, and we did around 44 batches of yttrium-90 acetate with an RCP of 98%. With this, we approached our DE Radiopharmaceutical Committee to give us permission to consider this yttrium-90 acetate as a clinical grade, and so that we can go ahead in making formulation for yttrium dotatate. So with the permission, with the whatever data we had, we shared with the radiopharmaceutical committee, and they gave us the signal to go ahead, and we formulated yttrium-90 dotatate, and after formulating that dotatate, we used an animal experiment. Now this is a chromatogram which shows the purity of the yttrium-90 dotatate, which is a single peak. Now we use this cell line experiment to show that there is specific internalization of yttrium dotatate in cancerous cell where somatostatin receptor is expressed. We used AR42J cell line, which is a pancreatic carcinoma expressing somatostatin receptor. In this cell line, if you look at the histogram, there was an increased cell binding compared to the control cell line, which is the MCF cell line, which lacks somatostatin receptor. And even the cell, we found out this not only bound to the cell, it also got internalized. That also we demonstrated. Then we did an animal experiment. We created mouse model. This nude mouse, we developed a neuroendocrine tumor. We injected 90 yttrium dotatate and we imaged it. We saw that there was a concentration of radioisotope in the tumor. We did the biodistribution. We saw the biodistribution. There was statistically significant concentration of pressure in the tumor area. With this results, we again went back to DAE Pharmaceutical Radiopharmaceutical Committee. We showed them, and we requested permission for human clinical trial. And looking at the data, when for clinical trial permission was given, we got 2 patients. Now these are the patients where you see the gallium dotatate scan, which shows large spread of tumors, and when they were given yttrium dotatate therapy, you can see this is the radiation of the bremsstrahlung radiation from yttrium-90. So there was uptake of the dotatate. This is the second patient. After 1 cycle, they came back after 3 months. After 3 months, when we repeated the gallium scan, we saw that the lesion have quite disappeared or have become less. Again, they went for the second therapy. The uptake of yttrium dotatate was much lesser, which showed that the yttrium-90 dotatate was remarkably having a beneficial effect on these kind of patients. This is the publication which was published by my colleagues. Now these are some of the list of the upcoming radiopharmaceuticals, and they have been RPC approved, and they are for different disease, right from breast cancer to non-Hodgkin lymphoma and other things. Now, just want to mention the recent, which is the highlight of the today's for this year for our department, is the introduction of alpha radionuclide therapy. Shortly in June 2021, we are going to start with actinium-225. Actinium-225 is an alpha emitter. Actinium-225 can be combined with dotatate as well as PSMA-617, and they can help in those patients having small cell cluster carcinoma or a single cell carcinoma where lutetium and yttrium may not be suitable. So we will have an entire range of pharmaceuticals. This is the acknowledgement. These are my colleagues who had worked for the yttrium-90 dotatate work. This is acknowledgement to my radiopharmacy team. This is a team we are involved in the production of radiopharmaceuticals, both for diagnosis as well as for therapy. And these are my mentors who have influenced me for my kind of work. In my conclusion, I extend sincere thanks to my team at RMC for supporting the patient service in the pandemic time. I thank Dr. Dilip Tiwari and his team at HeriQuare Healthcare Limited and Usman University, KwaZulu-Natal, for the opportunity for giving me this opportunity to place my talk. Thank you, dear participants and listeners who have been patiently listening to me, and wish you all a safe stay wherever you are. Thank you.
Colleagues, due to time constraints, we're going to have to move to our next speaker. If you have any further questions or comments for Mr. Ray, you can send it to us and we will be sure to pass it to him and he will see if he can answer your question. Thank you so much. I was just informed due to some unforeseen circumstances, Dr. Ramsuran won't be joining us from KwaZulu-Natal's Research, Innovation and Sequencing Platform. However, I believe that on his behalf is postdoc Dr. Tilona Armuban will be presenting. So Tilona, if you are here, you can proceed.
Okay. Hello, I am Tilona, and I'll be presenting on behalf of Dr. Ramsuran. Okay, so when COVID-19 initially blazed through Asia, Europe, and the US, many global health experts worried that it could be catastrophic for Africa, with its crowded cities, poorly funded health sector, and lack of testing facilities. In April 2020, the UN predicted up to 300,000 deaths for Africa that were related to COVID. However, it was the US with its superior health system that surpassed this grim milestone. As of May 11th, 2021, the overall death toll for the whole of Africa has only reached 125,000, with South Africa accounting for roughly 43% of this total. These numbers are far less than what is seen in Europe, America, and now India. Now, it's important to note that several factors contribute to disease susceptibility and pathogenesis. These factors include environmental factors, which include the virus itself and lifestyle choices, epigenetic factors, which are factors that are able to alter gene expression without actually altering the DNA sequence. And what I will be discussing today is some genetic factors, which are specific mutations or variations within our gene that have been strongly implicated with non-communicable diseases and genetic disorders, but are also able to confer susceptibility or resistance to infectious diseases. Host genetic contribution to disease susceptibility is as equally as important as the viral genetics and should be thoroughly investigated. So in this presentation, I'll be discussing the Duffy antigen receptor for chemokines, which may contribute to COVID-19 susceptibility and the ethnic disparity that we see with COVID-19. So the Duffy antigen receptor for chemokines, known as DAC or atypical chemokine receptor 1, is a transmembrane protein found in red blood cells, endothelial cells, and nerve cells. It is a promiscuous receptor that's involved in regulating plasma levels of chemokines, which are important in immunity as they guide effector immune cells to the sites of infection and inflammation. DAC is able to recognize chemokines with CC and CXC motifs, and what it does is it internalizes these chemokines and degrades them, thus influencing immunity and inflammation. So the DAC gene has 3 common alleles. The functional alleles are FYA and FYB, and they're a result of a non-synonymous mutation that is associated with AB blood group antigens. As you can see in the map, these functional alleles are highly prevalent in individuals of Asian and European descent, while we can only really see them in South African individuals in Africa. However, there also exists a non-functional allele known as FYO, and this is defined by a mutation 46 base pairs upstream of the transcriptional start site of DAC. What this mutation does is it prevents transcription factors from binding onto the promoter and results in the reduced transcription and expression of DAC. This mutation is found exclusively in individuals of African descent and is highly prevalent in West Africa. The genetic the genetic, if you recall the map I showed earlier, which was the distribution of COVID infections across the world, we can see that functional dark alleles are associated with regions that are highly susceptible to COVID, which is Europe and Asia, whereas the non-functional allele is prevalent in Africa, which has much lower rates of infection. If we focus specifically on South Africa, we can see that there is a distribution of functional alleles for dark, and that may explain why South Africa is so highly affected by COVID-19 infection compared to the rest of Africa. Well, the knowledge on dark and COVID hasn't been thoroughly investigated, but the associations of this genetic mutation has been shown to either confer resistance or susceptibility to specific diseases. For example, individuals that have the CC genotype for dark are resistant against malaria as they lack the dark receptor, which the Plasmodium virus uses to gain entry into red blood cells. So if they lack dark, there's going to be less entry of malaria parasite. However, these individuals are highly susceptible to inflammatory conditions such as asthma and breast cancer because there's less receptor to internalize and degrade excess chemokines. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about dark and its role in HIV acquisition and disease progression because HIV and COVID do share some similarities, as well as because HIV is highly prevalent in South Africa. So it was originally thought that the dark receptors on red blood cells binds to HIV and prevents its entry into T cells. However, while individuals with the CC genotype, because they lack dark, HIV was more likely to enter T cells. However, emerging evidence has now shown that dark expression on red blood cells binds to HIV, where HIV remains viable and transports it to its target T cells. It also binds and degrades chemokine ligands, which is usually involved in suppressing HIV entry. So given that COVID-19 is a disease that we're still trying to understand, it's important that we try to apply knowledge from other diseases and associated with COVID-19. Seeing as dark plays a role in the acquisition and pathogenesis of inflammatory and infectious disease, it's possible that it may play a role in COVID-19, which is a viral disease that's characterized by chemokine storm and inflammation. Thus, in a pilot study, our team investigated the association of COVID-19 disease acquisition and dark expression. So as you can see, we found that there was a significant increase in dark levels amongst COVID-positive individuals compared to negative individuals. It's possible that dark may be transporting COVID-19 to other traditional receptors and influencing the chemokine pool and thus immune response. We further stratified this data to show an associated dark expression and COVID-19 status across Black and Caucasian individuals. We found that dark was higher in Caucasian individuals, and this could be that the CC genotype in the Black individuals is influencing this expression. We also evaluate the expression of other traditional COVID-19 receptors such as ACE, TMPR, SS2, and NRP1 in COVID positive and negative individuals, and we found that ACE and NRP expression was significantly higher in COVID positive individuals compared to negative individuals. So what this data shows is that seeing as this is a pilot study, we have a lot more work to do. What we would like to do is evaluate the expression of dark in a much larger cohort across different ethnicities, such as Black, Indian, and Caucasian individuals, evaluate dark surface expression on red blood cells and whether there is functional binding of the COVID-19 virus to the receptor. And we would like to associate the dark mutation with COVID-19 acquisition as well as disease severity. Thank you.
Hello, good evening and good morning. Let's welcome our next speakers first speaker, in fact, for second session, Professor Savita Kulkarni. She is a veteran radiopharmaceutical researcher from BARC, and she has been deeply involved with mycobacterium tuberculosis research, and also she is a resource person for various radio-labeled reagents and for indispensable for various research and therapeutic options. And
yeah, so today what I'm going to actually speak about is the immunomodulators as an adjunct therapy in tuberculosis. At Radiation Medicine Center, which are part of Bhabha Atomic Research Center, we are working in tuberculosis, field of tuberculosis, for various angles which are actually involved in the control of tuberculosis, like diagnosis, molecular epidemiology, drug development, vaccine development, and so on. So everybody is aware of the TB global scenario, which is like around 10 million new cases per year, 1.5 million deaths per year, around 6 lakhs cases of co-infection with TB and HIV, 4 lakhs, 50,000 infection with MDR TB. And what about India? Oh my God, the scenario is really bad. Like 40% of the population is infected, 2 million new cases, annually 0.4 million deaths, almost 2 minutes. Hello. Almost 0.24. Somebody's microphone is not muted, I think. It is this, I'm getting some sound. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, absolutely audible.
Okay, fine. So almost 0.45 million deaths in 2019. And there are, of course, 5% TB which are HIV positive. Initially, it was very high. But right now, we are doing a little better. But the most concern is about like whatever we are contributing in the world burden. So the immune response in tuberculosis is something like this. Once a person gets infected, that person has got 10% chance of getting disease in its lifetime. So that is not very high at all. But still, why this particular pathogen is making havoc throughout the world? This particular pathogen is intracellular pathogen which infects macrophages and dendritic cells. The immune host system is a critical factor both for the containment and the cure of the immune tuberculosis infection. And what are the immune responses helpful for the control of tuberculosis? It is the Th1 immune response, M1 activation of macrophages, nitric oxide production, phagolysosome fusion, induction of apoptosis and autophagy, and activation of dendritic cells. So now the immune response develops, the active tuberculosis develops because of the perturbation of the host immune response. Surely, because 90% of the human population able to control tuberculosis. It is that 10% of the population, those who are infected, can get the disease. The virulence factors expressed by the pathogenic MTB actively inhibits the normal mechanism of the human responses, which add to their pathogenicity and facilitate the disease development. So the fate of infected macrophages affects the host resistance in MTB infection. Like if the macrophage, the MTB is virulent, then it will go to the, it will actually inhibit the phagolysosome fusion. It will induce the necrosis, and finally there'll be an infection in the macrophages. But in case of macrophages, which if it is getting infected with the attenuated M tuberculosis, then in case of that, actually there'll be apoptosis, there'll be restrictions of bacterial replication, and there'll be phagocytosis of apoptic vesicles. And then finally, it will go for the priming of the host. which will finally give the immune response. So the emergence of drug-resistant strain for tuberculosis is an alarming situation. And this is because of the side effects of the current drug regimen, because of the non-compliance, long duration of the treatment, and the treatment is complex, requires a longer use of the 4 drugs, sometimes 6 drugs, if it is MDR or if it is XDR. And because of that, the treatment may continue for 6 months or 9 months, even sometimes for 1.5 years. And they are, of course, toxic. And because of that, many people leave the treatment halfway, that is the non-compliance. And of course, it is the failure of healthcare system. So now the time has come, we have almost 20 drugs in the pipeline. And in that case, in spite of that, we do have the drug resistance coming up. So what is the alternative? So we should have the approaches which are novel, which are targeting our host immunity rather than the pathogen, and immunomodulator is an alternative. So what are the major goals of immunomodulation in tuberculosis? It is potentiating the host immune system better to control the TB, strengthening the patient's native immunity, negating the biological effect of the bacilli on the host, including the production of beneficial cytokines, amplifying their protective effect, establishing the homeostasis between the Th1, that is the cell-mediated, and the Th2, that is the humoral response. As all of us are aware, that Th1 response, that is the cell-mediated immune response, is the one which we actually require for tuberculosis, to cure tuberculosis or fight with tuberculosis. So immunomodulators sometimes may not offer the total protection. So it can offer us, with the addition of, it will offer us as an adjunct therapy. What do you mean by adjunct therapy? It is in addition to our regular therapy, we use immunomodulators to boost our immunity. So we in our lab have worked in a polysaccharide which we have isolated, we have patent for it. We have isolated from Tinospora cardiifolia, which is well-known Ayurvedic drug, which is also called as Gulai or Guduchi. And it is actually a part of various Ayurvedic composition. The chemical property of G1/4A is an acidic arabinogalactan, and it's a huge molecule because it is a polymer. The biological function says it is mitogenic to B cells, protects mice from septic shock. Macrophages are principal targets of G1/4A, and it also augments the dendritic cell maturation. Macrophages are one of the most important sentinels of innate immune system, and that play very crucial role in host defense, especially the innate immune system. And activation of macrophage is the key source of reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen intermediates, and inflammatory cytokines that are used for defense against the microbial invasion. And surely these are very important in case of TB as well. So we have used the raw cell line, which is a mouse macrophage cell line, and we evaluated the effect of G1/4A. And the initial findings showed us that G1/4A activates the murine macrophages through a classical pathway, that is the M1 activation. It upregulates the expression of pro-inflammatory cytokines and the nitric oxide, which are very important for infectious disease cure. It also upregulates the CDC86 and MC major histocompatibility complex 2, and activates P3 and ERK, that is the MAP kinase pathway, which leads to activation of, so all this actually leads to activation of macrophages. And finally, it is activating to TLR4 and MYD88 dependent pathway. So in a minute, I'll tell you what do you mean by actually TLRs are the molecules which are pattern recognition molecules through which actually there is an entry of various pathogens, or because of that, after the molecule is attached to the TLR ligands, actually there is induction of various signal transduction inside the cell, and which finally leads to the synthesis of pro-inflammatory cytokines and nitric oxide, which are actually involved in killing of the cells. So the direct anti-TB activity of G1/4A, it doesn't have the direct killing. So it is not like any rifampicin or ethambutol or isoniazid. It is not like that. It is not like an antibiotic. because it is an immunomodulator. It is acting through the TLR. The cell toxicity was monitored by MTT assay, and there was no direct effect of MTB, and this is not toxic to even the human cells. And so finally, what we saw when we actually use various lineages of Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Now, here I would like to explain to you that just like how the human beings have their own DNA fingerprintings, like Mycobacterium tuberculosis also has its own DNA fingerprintings. And on that basis, actually, Mycobacterium tuberculosis are divided into different lineages. And the Beijing lineage is actually the one is the most dangerous lineage, is famous in the world, which is usually is an MDR strain and XDR strain. And there are some other strains which are ancient strains and which are not that pathogenic at all. So we have seen that when we took the S37RV, which is a laboratory strain, Beijing, which is actually isolated from a patient, which was a 10-drug resistant strain, and a LAM, which is another Latin American strain, which was a 6-drug resistant strain, all when we actually infected in THP1 cells and treated with G1/4A, everything shows that there was an intracellular clearance of this particular MTB lineages. That means G1/4A inhibits the intracellular survival of all sensitive S37RV and MDR as well as XDR strains of MTB in raw cell line. G1/4A also inhibits the survival of raw cells by the action is by the NO production, and it is in the TLR4 MYD dependent manner. That's we have proved it. And how we proved it? We use actually siRNA, and we added an siRNA, we added TLR4 antibodies, and this way we proved that yes, when we added the siRNA, actually the effect was negated. And also when we added the inhibitor for NO synthesis, again the effect which we observed for G1/4A was not there. That means the G1/4A is actually working through the NO production and through the TLR4 MYD88 pathway, which is for NOS production. So finally, from this particular thing, we could conclude that the G1/4A increases the production of nitric oxide, and by upregulating the nitric oxide synthase, G1/4A upregulates the surface expression of MHC2 and CD86, which is very, very important for macrophage activation. It also enhances the phagocytosis. We also saw that it is intracellular survival of that is MYD88, TLR4 MYD88 dependent, and NO dependent is also the killing is attributed to. So finally, this was the cartoon which we actually created for the mechanism of action, where G1/4A binds to the TLR4, induces the MYD8 pathway, there is a MAP kinase involved, and which finally creates the NF-kappa B and the pro-inflammatory cytokines, the MHC2, CD6, and finally NO, which probably leads to intracellular killing of MTB. Evaluation, when we did all these studies in vivo, that is in BALB/c mice, we injected in BALB/c mice the strain, that is the MTB strain, and then we treated the with G1/4A. We give the intravenous injections of G1/4A for a long time. And then we saw that yes, G1/4A also inhibits the MTB loads in the lung of infected mice. And of course, this particular killing was enhanced when we used the isoniazid with this particular G1/4A. That means this particular experiment showed us that yes, G1/4A can be used as an adjunct therapy, because here we used only isoniazid. Imagine if it is the 4 drugs plus G1/4A, surely it will give the sterilizing effect of the lungs of the mice. So now with this experiments, we know that yes, the bacillary burden in the lungs is going down in the BALB/c mice. It is surely offering protection, suggesting it is as an adjunct activity. It is also, we have also seen, which I have not shown here, that it is augmenting the INF interferon gamma and IL-4 ratio, which is showing that actually it is inducing the Th1 response. And surely the Th1 response is responsible for the protection offered by G1/4A. So at this stage, we are going for the clinical trials, and we are looking for the partners of the industry who can really help us in production of G1/4A on a larger quantities, do pharmacokinetics and dynamic studies, and go in with clinical trials. So these are the other. So this is finally the cartoon where actually it is showing that we did everything in mice lungs, we did in serum, and everywhere final effect was the MTB in the lungs was the lung load was actually decreased. So importance of the study is, yes, surely the modulation is there. So modulators can be used, natural modulators can be used, and so further studies we surely can do with the help of in the clinical trials, as it is part of the Ayurvedic therapy. It is the problem will not be there to take G1/4A for people, and it will be very, very safe. Now, these are the publications which we actually, there is one PLOS one, then International Immunopharmacology, and also in tuberculosis, which we published for the G1/4A studies. Other compounds we have studied, our lab is studying a lot of compounds, almost 14, 15 compounds are in the pipeline where we are studying the anti-TB properties as well as the immunomodulatory properties of various compounds. And curcumin, everybody knows it's a very, very good compound which has got antimicrobial activity, because it has got antioxidant property, it has got angiogenesis property, anti-inflammatory property, and anti-cancer property. So we decided actually to concentrate on curcumin to start with. And finally, we saw that curcumin also inhibits the intracellular survival of MTB in the raw cells, and curcumin itself is not toxic. So it is the immunomodulatory role of curcumin which is actually helping to reduce the intracellular, to inhibit the intracellular survival of MTB. So we use two strains here, and we showed that yes, curcumin is inhibiting. This also we published. And afterwards, what is the mode of action? So reports suggest that curcumin induces apoptosis as well as autophagy. Both of these functions are very, very important in immune response and to control the intracellular pathogens. And so we did various studies, and we found out that when we actually use the autophagy inhibitor, the whatever action we had seen, that was negated, and that shows that the curcumin is actually the acting towards inducing the autophagy. And also MTB inhibits the phagolysosome fusion that we are already knowing, and we also proved that curcumin induces phagolysosome fusion in MTB infected cells, and this is how probably the clearance takes place. Due to low there's just two more slides. Yes. Due to low solubility and poor bioavailability, like we overcome this particular issue by creating the nanoparticles. And finally, we saw that whatever actions we saw with the curcumin, we also saw with the nanoparticles with the three-fold enhancement in the bioavailability. So surely the novel approach of host-directed therapy, where we can use the immunomodulator as an adjunct therapy, will be very good for tuberculosis in the times to come, because as soon as the drug is developed, there is an drug resistant already there. So this particular thing is devoid. Here there is no risk of drug resistant development, because we are just boosting our own immunity. And this is why curcumin and our G1/4A can really be a potential for the adjunct therapy which we can use. And these are the people, those who actually did the study, G1/4A study, Dr. Pramod Kumar Gupta, which we carried out in ICGB, and curcumin study we did from ICT and with Pramod Kumar Gupta. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this really transformational work. And with COVID-19 pandemic being such a so much pathology associated with dysregulated immune responses, I think there could be some application of this immunomodulation on COVID-19 also. And we can't take questions right now because of time issues. So please keep on adding your queries in event chat, and we will make it sure to convey it to the presenter. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I'm very honored and happy to invite my next speaker in this session, and he's Dr. Aditya Narayan Kunamneni. He's my colleague, and he's actually a very aggressive protein biologist, and he has a unique technology to develop immunotherapeutics in form of SCFE fragments and antibodies by ribosomal displays. And he has been working with very deadly viruses like Zika and Ebola in past, and he has been instrumental in developing a lot of new technology to combat COVID-19. So I'm really happy to invite him to present his work. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk on cross-neutralizing SCFE antibodies for COVID-19 therapies. As you know, monoclonal antibodies are expensive and cumbersome. In addition, some proteins are not immunogenic or reveal toxic to the animals and cannot lead to efficient antibody selection. Monoclonal antibodies are large molecules of about 150 kDa, and it sometimes limits their use in assays with several reagents competing for close epitopes recognition. Because of these limitations, the use of smaller antibody-derived molecules has emerged. So single-chain variable fragment antibodies have been commonly used as alternatives in this regard. So SFE consists of only light chain and heavy chain variable regions of immunoglobulins connected by peptide linker. Their average molecular weight is about 27 kDa. The linker is usually rich in glycine for flexibility as well as serine for solubility. Can either connect the N terminus of VH with the C terminus of VL or vice versa. Advantages: SCFE is encoded by single gene, and they feature similar binding activity as IgG, but a stronger tissue and brain penetrability. These antibodies can be converted into intrinsically fluorescent platform using multicolored fluorophores that link the variable domains while preserving binding properties against target protein. The production of these antibodies is innovative, inexpensive, and rapid. The use of multiple inherently fluorescent antibodies provide for flexibility in use in diagnostic use, also for animal imaging. Disadvantages: small size, rapid clearance. These issues have been addressed by genetically manipulating and engineering single chain antibodies to yield diabodies, triabodies, tetrabodies. And lack of effector functions. So this can be addressed by linking the SCFE to the FC fragment of desired species and keep their specificity and binding property. So I have refined a rapid ribosomal display method to develop panels of single chain antibodies against a target of choice. Our technology allows for the innovative, inexpensive, rapid development of antibody therapeutics and diagnostics for pathogenic viruses and also for other diseases. So this technology I have applied for infectious diseases including COVID-19 and also for chronic pain, cancer, and many more. Using this technology, we are able to generate libraries with high diversity up to 10 to 15. We can isolate extremely high affinity binders against a variety of targets. We can produce antibodies with picomolar affinities. All the steps involved in this technology in vitro. In combination with the DNA mutagenesis, this technology offers a powerful means of protein evolution in vitro. This approach offers a good way for antibody maturation and improving the biophysical properties. One disadvantage is inherent stability. of RNA. I will show you how our technology works. Immunize the mice with the target antigen, then remove the spleen to extract total RNA, generate antibody libraries. The coupled in vitro transcription and translation reactions are performed on the SCFE antibody library. Since these templates have the terminal stop codon removed, the protein ribosome complex will stall, thus retaining mRNA. The resulting preformed antibody ribosome mRNA complexes are incubated in the target coated tubes. Only complexes with the SCFE antibody that binds the target will be retained. Irrelevant complexes are removed by washing. After selection, under very stringent conditions, the retained antibody complexes are recovered by RT-PCR as the DNA. Further manipulation and protein expression are carried for at least 3 to 5 cycles to obtain antibody rates. So using this technology, we have generated antibodies against Ebola viruses. So Ebola virus has a single-stranded negative sense 19 kb RNA genome encoding 8 structural proteins, including the nucleoprotein, virion proteins, polymerase protein, transmembrane glycoprotein, and a soluble glycoprotein. The Ebola glycoprotein is the only virally expressed protein on virion surface and is critical for the attachment to host cell and fusion of the viral and host cell membranes. And we selected Ebola GP as a target because it is a very good, excellent target for diagnostics and therapy. So using our technology, we made a panel of single chain antibodies against Ebola GP. So we managed to isolate at least 10 antibodies against this target. And 2 of the antibodies we tested on ELISA. Antibody 4-2, antibody 22-1 showed the strongest binding to all 6 Ebola species. And the antibody 4-2 demonstrated about almost 2-fold enhanced binding compared to the SCFE 22-1. An immunofluorescence assay was performed to confirm the recognition of these antibodies with the proteins, glycoproteins from Ebola, Sudan, and Marburg in its natural membrane-associated trimeric structure with 293 T cells transfected with these plasmid glycoproteins expressing plasmid. So these 2 antibodies effectively recognized and stained the glycoproteins from these viruses expressed in the 293 T cells. The staining ability of SCFE 4-2 was superior to antibody 22-1, and these are comparable to the results of positive controls in the assay. And this is the first report on ribosome display SCFEs that can detect a broad set of filovirus genes, and which demonstrate their potential use in the development of new assays. So coronavirus, a new coronavirus causing COVID-19 pandemic, and many millions affected worldwide. And coronavirus got the family name from the spike protein on the viral particle. The highly glycosylated S protein stays compact in a trimeric state, recognizes ACE2 receptor on the host cell membrane, and then undergoes a series of conformation changes, proteolysis events, and membrane fusion to complete the viral entry. For vaccines and therapeutics, clinical diagnosis, early prevention, and medication, the S protein is the most significant target. Due to structural analogous regions of the Ebola virus GP and SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, so we made an effort to retest our previously binding Ebola antibodies to bind to SARS coronavirus 2 and neutralize its interaction with ACE2. So I'm showing the post docking interactions for the contacting residues at the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus 2 RBD and ACE2 interface. So these are the interacting residues which are in red. These are the crucial residues for the attachment. And I am showing the post simulation video for the interactions between ACE2 and SARS-CoV coronavirus 2. So you can see the RBD and ACE2, and you can see clearly the interactions from ACE2 to RBD, and these interactions are stable throughout 100 nanoseconds simulation. So we used Schrodinger software for molecular docking and also for MD simulations. So we tested our Ebola antibodies on ELISA against spike protein. So SCFE35-2, SCFE10-3 had the very good affinities in nanomolar range. In addition, these two antibodies also neutralized the live SARS coronavirus 2, and showing that our approach generated SCFEs that bind to both free and virus-bound spike protein. So we also predicted the conformation of SARS coronavirus 2 SRBD as well as its complex structures with these neutralizing antibodies, and found that the interactions between SRBD and certain our Ebola antibodies and the most residues on the epitope overlap with the RBD ACE2 binding interface, explaining the blocking effect and the neutralizing capacity. I used a lick plot to determine the interactions between these complexes. And you can see the most residues on the epitope overlap with RBD ACE2 binding interface. Here I am showing you the interactions between RBD and our antibody, one of our antibody. And you can see clearly and the interactions from antibody there from on VH, CDRs. And the interactions are pretty stable and throughout the simulation. Never go away. And the pretty stable interactions between RBD and SCFE 35-2. Also showing the post simulation results for other antibody with RBD. And you can so this is the VH, but different to CDRs from VH and interacting to the SRBD. And they're very close and interacting each other, and they're stable throughout the 100 nanoseconds simulation. As you know, new coronavirus has one or two more mutations that differentiated from predominant virus variants already circulating among the general population. These variants are expected to occur as the viruses are constantly changing. Surveillance can help to investigate how some variants may impact COVID-19 disease transmission and the effect of vaccines and therapeutics. So we tested our antibodies against spike variants for South African and UK. So testing of these two antibodies in ELISA shows differential binding to our spike protein carrying the E484K mutation associated with South African and UK variants of concern.
Dr.
And
Kunamuli,
we also
to inform you, we are running out of time. Kindly.
Yeah. I think in 2 minutes I will be done.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thank you. And the testing of these two antibodies also in competitive ELISA show that SCFE 35-2 is able to inhibit the ACE2 RBD binding interaction, whereas SCFE 10-3 does not. So right now we are working on engineering these Ebola antibodies to improve the affinity and efficacy against RBD, COVID-19 RBD. So this work is right now is going on in the lab. So we filed the patents on these antibodies and some of these publications on COVID-19. And these are our collaborators established from Mayo Clinic and other universities for all infectious diseases, also for other diseases as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Any
Kunamuli.
questions?
Yeah, please. Anybody have any questions? All right. Please, if you have any queries, please don't forget to add it into the event chat window. Moving on. So I'm
Hello. Hello.
So I'm happy to invite Dr. Sandeep Sharma. He's associate professor in Lovely Professional University, India, and he's a veteran proteomics protein specialist and also a drug discovery person. So this is something really relevant pipeline. He's going to share a really relevant pipeline applicable to COVID-19 also. But his main research work is on MTB. So I invite Dr. Sandeep Sharma. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Am I audible? Hello.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, we can.
You can also see the screen.
We could see your slide, but now we can't see.
Now is visible?
No, please switch to the yeah. Now we can see.
Okay. Anyways, okay. So thanks for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to deliver a talk at the basics, what we normally do in drug discovery. So although the topic is combinational therapy to treat antimicrobial resistance for this respiratory pathogens, so that today's topic is how we can encounter or use different combination therapies for Mycobacterium tuberculosis treatment. Okay. So as we know that the pathogen, we already Dr. Kulkarni had said about a lot of things about the basics of this. So it's acid-fast bacilli. We can see it. The genome was sequenced by Professor S.T. Cole in 1998, and after that, a lot of information has been come out, and people start analyzing what actually happened. If you look at the global scenario, this the literature which I got is from Global Tuberculosis Report 2020. You can look, two areas are very focused. Basically, if you look at African countries and especially to the India, right? Whether it is an estimation of TB, whether it is a relapse of TB, or you can say the TB cases in HIV, non-HIV patients. Right? So what actually is that although the things are more focused nowadays on COVID, but still the existing pandemics or global emergencies are there, like a tuberculosis. So if you look at 1.4 million people died in 2019, right? And the major risk again include those persons have some kind of like infections through MDR, XDR, HIV, immunocompromised, and other socio conditions, whether malnutrition, long-term facility, caretakers, and all those. But still, we believe that it is curable, right? Am I audible?
Sir, your screen is not so much.
Hello.
Please maximize the PPT.
Yeah, I did. Then people. Now is it?
No, it's good. It's good. Yes.
Okay, fine. Okay. So what actually in the medical need for tuberculosis is, we know that the toxicity is associated with long-term therapy, and we have like a 6-month therapy for TB in susceptible cases, and which can be increased if we have what? If we have it like a MDR or XDR, you can say infection. Compliance is very low, toxicity is very high, and in 6 months we have a large number of drug resistance or emergence of drug resistance. So what actually we do? This is just a scenario where we have a susceptible infection. But when we talk about these resistant forms, the drugs which we normally use is second-line drugs, which are low efficacy, high toxicity, and on an average we have like a 14,000 pills will be given to a patient in 6 months' time. That is the biggest challenge with these therapies, right? These are some of the drugs which actually include in first-line TB therapy and second-line, right? So based upon this, what actually need to be done is that how we can control or what new properties or desired properties for new TB drugs should be there. So the novel mode of action, that means we look for some of the molecules which actually have some kind of novel molecule of action, or we can combine with some, either with the drug or with some synthetic molecule or with some natural molecule, right? So that anyhow we can stop or at least limit the emergence of drug resistance in the form of MDR and XDR, right? Also, we have to work on those molecules which actually work against the non-replicating mycobacteria, which is actually a biggest challenge in this, which actually helps the phenotype resistance to most of the antibiotics and resulted out of what? Responsible for the lengthy treatment. Also, we have to look at the orally viability and low toxicity, or you can see the low cost of good antibiotic used for TB treatment. What actually the study we use is we use first-line TB drug rifampicin, which is most potent drug because it can work both as actively growing mycobacterium as well as the non-replicating one. So we combine this with the piperine, and piperine, if you look at, is a old component, or you can say the component which is normally used in Ayurveda and have a property of inhibit the human glycoproteins, P glycoproteins, and also it can inhibit C by 4, this cytochrome 450. This is also known as one of the viability enhancer. So this is the basis of our research, that we combine these both, a drug which is in use and a molecule which of use in traditional medicine. So what we do is we just perform an in vitro assay where we have used agar diffusion assay, and we just perform an assay. And what we did is that we just take a piperine alone and this rifampicin alone and combine with piperine at 12.5 and 25 microgram per ml, and we see that there is a zone enhancement of where we use this combination of piperine and rifampicin at a concentration of 25 microgram. Further, the experiment, these all experiment, what we need is as a preclinical studies, right? So what we do is we test this same combination against H37RB, which is actually a standard strain for all kind of, you can say, mycobacterial test. And we also create a lab generated mutant which actually resistance to rifampicin. What we found is that we are actually the resistant to rifampicin, it works more efficiently because it gives at least 4-fold reduction in the MIC of that particular strain. Based upon that, we also go to another parameter, what we call as mutation frequency of rifampicin, which we find is greater than 10 raised to power -9 if we just use as a rifampicin alone. But when we combine it, like what we can say with piperine 25, it can reduce to 10 raised to power -9, which actually bring about the concentration of rifampicin in its Cmax level, which is around 12 to 15 microgram per ml. Right? Whereas if you can check rifampicin alone, its MPC is greater than 80 microgram per ml. So this combination is anyhow working, but still we are not sure how it is going to work. Then we also perform another parameter, what we call as post-antibiotic effect, which actually increased while we add a piperine at a concentration of 25 microgram per ml. And it increased its post-antibiotic effect almost double at like what we can say at a sub-MIC, double MIC, or you can say the 4x of MIC. Based upon this, we also go for the kill kinetic study, that whether it clears some the load of mycobacteria in combination or not. So if you look at this picture, picture A, which actually is rifampicin alone, and if you see the combination of piperine at 25 microgram, you can see that here the 50, we cannot detect the cell less than the 50, you can say microgram, this CFU count 50 per ml. But when you combine with piperine, it can reduce and give us a clear-cut indication that yes, there is a no mycobacteria left when we combine rifampicin with piperine, even at a higher concentration. So it clear-cut indicates that there is some kind of synergetic effect which actually needs to be done, right? So once we do that, we also work on, this is just one part, that what we do at in vitro level, right? Based upon our diagnostic, we also work on some of that how we can find out these mycobacterial cell in our blood cells. So what we develop a method where we can actually develop, where we can actually identify even the blood cells are like 2 or 3 per ml of blood. We can also detect by using one of our method, and that method is also published in the journal, right? So this data already we have published. Right? Based upon that, then we have focus on that. If this is something which actually encounter, you can say, bringing the resistance to the, you can say, lower level. So let's try something. So we know that ethidium bromide is a substrate for a majority of the efflux pumps. So what we do, we try to check the MIC in presence of ethidium bromide and rifampicin, and we find that there is a reversal of the MIC of ethidium bromide in the presence of piperine, which is most likely similar to a well-known this efflux pump inhibitor, resarpine. So looking at that, we just selected a one efflux pump RB1258C because we have find that there are some of the initial reports which actually that in the presence of rifampicin it's just overexpressed. So what we do, we just find the expression when we grow this rifampicin resistance chain in the presence of sub-MIC of rifampicin. There is a one protein RB1258C which overexpressed and which shows 3.4 almost fourfold of you can say induction in the presence of rifampicin. But when we add piperine, right, it reduced, that expression is lower down to some extent. Right? So this is docking results which we compare with some of the known inhibitor where we use reserpine, verapamil, and compare this with the piperine, and we get a very good result that this will work very nicely. So this same study will be published in JACC, where we for the first time proposed that piperine as an inhibitor of RB1258C as a putative efflux pump against MTV. Right? Looking at this, what actually with the data we get at in vitro, we just move to the in vivo system, right? So first we just proliferate these cells in a cell line by using both the standard CON-A and LPS, and we find that the effect of the T cell is more apparent in when we add a piperine to these cells. So we try to estimate few of the cells, like we test for this interleukin, IFN gamma, and we find that at a concentration of like piperine from 1 to 100, we find a very good effect both in case of IFN gamma upregulation, IL-2, NO production, and other you can say cytokines. So it gives us a promising, like you can say, encouraging data that yes, it also works as a efflux pump in vitro and also work as a immunomodulator. So what we do, we develop a prophylactical model that how we can test it. So what we do, we make a prophylactic model that we just treat these animals first 8 months without causing giving them infection, and then continue after infection for 8 weeks. What we find, the result was very encouraging that the cytokine response is although similar what we get at in our previous experiment. What the most important part is that the CFU count remains intact. That this is our early control and this is our late control. Compared to our late control, you can see at piperine 10, where we use prophylactically for first 8 weeks, we just treat them with piperine. You just find that this particular molecule do not allow even the proliferation, or you can say the growth of mycobacteria in the cells. So then we just recheck our data with using the QRT-PCR for both this IL-2, IFN gamma at both the concentration piperine at 1 mg per kg body weight and piperine at 10 mg per kg body weight. So same experiment we just repeat in a therapeutic model where we just combine this piperine at a 10 mg kg body weight, which we get the max effective dose at our prophylactic model. So we combine this rifampicin 10 mg per kg body weight with rifampicin, piperine 10 mg per kg. Also, we increase the dose of rifampicin from 10 to 20, and parallelly we make the stable dose of piperine. What we get, the results were very interesting. That if you look at this picture A and B, the rifampicin, although it brings 3 log reduction at 20, whereas at 20 plus piperine 10 mg, we didn't get any, you can say, growth of the CFU count even after like a 1 month of our incubation at 37 under CO2. But what actually interesting is you can see that whenever we have piperine at 10 mg, the effect is almost what we get at rifampicin 20 alone. So the same effect we will get at rifampicin 10 plus piperine 10 mg per kg body weight. So it's quite encouraging of that this combination therapy will both work in vitro as an influx port model and in vitro as a immunomodulator. Right? So we propose that this theory will work. So what actually we conclude from the theory is that the result of this study suggested that piperine also work as a efflux pump inhibitor, where they inhibit the expression of RB1258C, which also we also proved the same study in our other bacteria like S. aureus too, right? Whereas if we can look at the in vivo study, we found that for the first time reported the detailed immunomodulatory activity of piperine with reference to the protective immunity mediated through Th1 cytokines, that it enhanced the activity of rifampicin. So piperine in combination with rifampicin might be improved its therapeutic efficacy in immunocompromised TB patients. Right? So what this also study we published in a tuberculosis few years back. Although this is not the complete study, but combination of rifampicin, isoniazid, and this piperine is already commercialized by this Cadila, and this is already in use almost, I think, from 10 years, which is approved by DGCI so many years back. That is the work, and this is something what we have that few of the students working on. We are also working on some other pathogens like pneumonia, Staph aureus, Pseudomonas. This is the group, my associates, which we got overseas collaborations. This is what the career path acknowledgement from right from which different institute where I used to work. And lastly, I thanks to this conference organizer, especially thanks to Dr. Tiwari, Dr. Divakar, and other members who provided me opportunity to deliver a talk and give some of the glimpse what I did in last almost 10 to 15 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. That was a very enlightening and interesting presentation. And again, immunomodulators are very relevant for COVID-19 treatment as well. So hope you can also develop something for that. And I feel very humbled in presenting our... Hello? Yeah, I'm very nostalgic and humbled to present the next speaker. My teacher and my mentor, Dr. Deepa Bisht. We have worked together in past, and she has always been a really inspiring researcher in the field of tuberculosis. And she continues to do a lot of proteomic and especially the aminoglycoside drugs, which are actually both having first line and second line implications. So she is actually really broadening her work with drug delivery systems and upcoming research on tuberculosis. So I please welcome Deepa ma'am for presenting the interesting lecture. Thank you.
Dr. Deepa ma'am, just go through the slides.
Yes. I'm sharing. Yes. I'm sharing.
Okay, now just click on the slides on the presentation. After this orange color screen, yeah. Below we can see, yeah. Just first click on the sharing option. Then when you will see orange color button below, yes, we can see your slide now. Make it to the full screen.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much. It's good to go.
Yes. So good evening, everybody. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. So the title of the talk is Exploring Aminoglycosides Resistant Mycobacterium Tuberculosis Isolates through Proteomics and its Implication. See, already the previous speakers, they have given a background of TB. We know it is a infectious killer. And according to the latest report 2020, we know 10 million new cases. And India, it contributes maximum where 6.9 lakh patients have suffered from TB. So the enormity of the problem has worsened by the widespread development of MDR and XDR. And this picture, it shows that India, it contributes around 26%. See, and the end TB strategy, we know that they have set a goal for 2030, but our Honorable Prime Minister, he has given a goal for 2025. And we know that TB is a contagious disease caused by a bacterium, and MTB is the causative agent. So these are some of the characteristics. I'm not going into the details of these. And for the diagnosis of TB, basically, we have this bacteriological test, sputum microscopy. And we can do radiography, chest X-ray, we can do nucleic acid amplification and tuberculin skin test. And as far as vaccine is concerned, we know that till today we have only BCG. So it is the only vaccine available for protection against TB. and it is effective in protecting children. But however, the efficacy, it varies from 0 to 80%. Now, for the management of TB, we know that we have first-line drugs, we have second-line drugs, and recently we have some new TB drugs also. But the main problem of the TB is like the drug resistant. So drug resistant TB continues to be a public health threat. About 500,000 cases of resistant TB are there. 3 countries with the largest share of the global burden, out of which India almost contributes 27%. So intensified efforts are required to improve reporting of detected TB cases and assist to diagnosis and treatment. So that means more efficient treatment and diagnosis, they are urgently needed. And we know that there are certain mechanisms, certain genes are involved in drug resistance. So these are for different drugs. But still, what the problem is, still there are certain isolates we have which has this drug aminoglycoside resistance, but there is no mutation. So that is one of our prime concerns. So we have taken these aminoglycosides. So amikacin and kanamycin are the major second-line anti-TB drug for the treatment of drug-resistant TB. And these aminoglycosides, they basically inhibit the protein synthesis in susceptible bacteria by interacting with the translation step. An RRS gene encoding the 16S ribosomal RNA has been reported to be mutated. And molecular studies have indicated various mechanisms like permeability, efflux pumps, structural changes, and modification of drugs which are responsible for resistance. However, in 1/3 of the resistant isolates, new mutations have been found. So this is how it acts. So the research aimed at developing new methods and identifying and characterizing new drug targets is of prime importance. And as protein manifests most of the biological process, these are directive targets. So proteomics and bioinformatic approaches help in the identification and characterization of novel proteins which are directly or indirectly involved in resistance. So analysis of a complete mycobacterial proteome comprising of both hydrophilic as well as lipophilic proteins in relation to resistance is required. And it will lead to identification of some drugs which may provide foundation for the future drug design of diagnostic and therapeutics. So with this background, the objective of our work was basically to select these aminoglycoside resistant MTB isolates, and then to carry out the proteomic analysis by 2-dimensional electrophoresis, and then the identification of these proteins using MALDI mass spectrometry, and then analysis of protein using some bioinformatic tools and their characterization. So basically what we did is, for this total proteome, we have taken whole cell lysate. We separated the cytosolic protein, membrane protein, and the cell wall protein. So just coming to brief methodology, these isolates were taken from the repository, from the mycobacterial repository of our institute. Then the DST, that the drug susceptibility test for aminoglycosides, were confirmed by REBA method. And then these isolates which are selected were grown on Sortens medium, and then they were harvested. Sonicated proteins was extracted. Then this 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional electrophoresis was carried out. They were analyzed using PDQuest software. And then these differentially expressed proteins were analyzed using MALDI-TOF mass spectrometry. And then some in silico characterization. So this is a REMA test where the pink color indicates the positive growth of MTB and the blue indicates the inhibition of the bacterial growth. So these are the data of the 2-dimensional electrophoresis with the whole cell lysate. So we initially started with whole cell lysate proteins of amikacin and kanamycin resistant isolates and susceptible. So when we made this composite image, this was done with at least 5 isolates. And so there were certain proteins which were found to be differentially expressed. And we have taken those proteins which we found consistently in the 5 different isolates which we have taken. And so these are the magnified regions of these 2D gels where you see the difference in the spots. And then these proteins, they were identified by MALDI mass spectrometry. So these were the proteins which were identified in the whole cell lysate. Then coming to the membrane proteins. Then after making the whole cell lysate, they were ultracentrifuged, and we have separated the cytosolic and the membrane proteins. So when we analyze these membrane proteins, we found these spots to be differentially expressed. These are again the magnified region, and then these are the identified again by MALDI-TOF. So this is the list of the proteins which has been identified by using this MALDI-mass spectrum. Then further, we also analyze the cytosolic proteins. So this is the data for cytosolic proteins. And this is again the MALDI-mass spectrometry of the cytosolic proteins, 20 spots which we found to be differentially expressed. So, and the cell wall, the next slide I can show, this is the cell wall. So the presently one of my students, who's my present PhD students, is looking into the cell wall proteins. So this is the work which I'm presently doing. So when we compiled this data of the whole cell lysate cytosolic membrane proteins, so these were the proteins. So we got a lot of protein which were differentially expressed, but then we pinpointed on those proteins which was hypothetical or the protein with unknown function. So because we want to see that maybe the hypothetical proteins means that we know that the gene is there, but the function is not known. So we want to see that if there is any protein, whose function is not known, may be correlated with this aminoglycoside resistance. So these were out of so many proteins, these were the 11 proteins which we finally took as a hypothetical or the protein of unknown function. So this, as I already mentioned, this is the cell wall protein, which the work is currently going on. And for the previous proteins like membrane, cytosolic, and whole cell lysate, we did some modeling studies. And the 3D model of the hypothetical proteins. So these are with some proteins. I've not shown all but these are with some proteins where we have used amikacin and kanamycin. So this is with another 1360 protein with amikacin and kanamycin. And then we just tried to put them in different categories. So we found that most of the proteins, either they are in lipid metabolism or they are some regulatory proteins, or they are some protein related with virulence detoxification. So this we have characterized, they're put in different groups. So what we feel that the cumulative effect of these overexpressed protein could be involved in resistance, and these proteins might be used as diagnostic marker or a potential drug target, especially for the aminoglycoside resistance. And we also did some interactome analysis by string 10 to reveal, like this is for the protein 2005. So we did some interactome analysis to see that where these proteins are, to which other proteins it is binding. And beside this, we did some studies with E. coli. We expressed this protein in E. coli to see that if there is any shift in the MIC, in the minimum inhibitory concentration, is there any shift? So when we did this, so this is the data with these 3 proteins. You can see that this green color is uninduced and the purple is induced. So you can see that there is a marked difference in the MIC after incorporating this protein. So we can say that maybe that these proteins might be playing some role in imparting resistance. So as the initial findings indicate, the probable role of hypothetical proteins in aminoglycoside resistance, functional, immunological, and clinical relevance of these proteins becomes necessary. And the characterization of these hypothetical proteins with unknown function may provide information about new targets against resistant TB or neurodiagnostics. So now what we are doing is we are taking these proteins and we are trying to characterize this protein to see their functional and the immunological relevance, like if it can be used as a diagnostic marker. So this is the work which is currently undergoing. This work which I have presented, most of this work has already been published in good journals. So I acknowledge ICMR, which is my parent institute, the Department of Science and Technology, Biotechnology, Department of DBT for granting funds, and then Department of Microbiology and Molecular Biology, where we have this BSL-3 facility to carry out this TB work. And I acknowledge all my PhD students. And here I would like to mention that most of the work which I presented here has been done by Dr. Diwakar Sharma. So thank you.
Excuse me, ma'am, we could not see your screen in the last few slides.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yeah, ma'am. We could not see your last few slides.
From where? It was there.
From interactomes.
No, still it's
Yes,
not
this
there.
one. Now, see, can you see this? Can you see?
No, ma'am. We cannot see anything like that.
Nothing.
But this is.
It's a black screen for us.
Thing is off. Reshare your slides.
Reshare. Okay.
Your sharing button is off.
Can you see now? Can you see now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It's visual.
Okay. So this was the interrupt analysis where we want to see that the proteins that like this is the example. One example we have taken RB2005 to see that to which other proteins it interacts, so that it gives us some clue that where it is binding. And then we did some expression studies. And here, this is the data with the 3 proteins. We did some expression studies, means we express this protein in E. coli, and then to see that whether after, with the addition of this, is there any change in the MIC. So when we did this experiment, you can clearly see with the green and this violet, this is the uninduced and the induced one, there was a marked difference in the MIC. So that shows that these proteins might be playing some role in imparting this resistance, particularly aminoglycoside. So as the initial findings indicate the role of hypothetical proteins in aminoglycoside resistance, their functional, immunological, and clinical relevance becomes necessary. So characterization of these proteins with unknown function may provide information about new targets against resistant TB or neodiagnostics. And this is where we are presently working. And I acknowledge ICMR, which is my parent institute, and I acknowledge DST and DBT for granting funds, Department of Microbiology and Molecular Biology, where we have this BSL-3 facility for doing this TB work, and all my PhD students. And here I would especially like to mention Dr. Diwakar Sharma. Most of the work which I have presented here has been done by him.